Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Believe it when you actually see it happen, but yes, Ireland really has been told to collect 13 billion euros from Apple. Money like that makes it worth hiring some lawyers and sending it to appeal. But the mere fact the EU Commission saw fit to make the determination it did today is a pretty extraordinary statement. Altogether, it's been a bad few days for those who want more globalisation and more of that benign political environment for multinational companies. It's not clear who's to blame for the Apple tax problem. Apple, which paid little tax on the profits from its European sales, or Ireland, which allowed Apple to avoid that tax. It agreed the company could book most of those sales to a barely existent head office that was registered nowhere and thus paid no tax. But the EU Commission was clear it's not fair on the rest of us.
This decision sends a clear message. Member States cannot give unfair tax benefits to selected companies, no matter if they are European or foreign, large or small, part of a group or not.
It does send a message that is scary for the big corporates. Be wary about taking big gifts, because if you're given too much, it'll be taken away. Well, there is a sense that too much has been given away to big corporations on tax and beyond. The EU Commission says it's simply enforcing a state aid rule that's been around since 1958. But it does look like politics responding to recent public disquiet. And there's another timely example of that as well. 3 years in discussion, a European trade and investment deal with the US called TTIP is in trouble. If not ominously close to the rubbish tip, it appears trapped in the land of never-ending negotiation.
Ces discussions ne pourront pas.
There will not be an agreement by the end of the year. The discussions are bogged down. Positions have not been respected. The lack of balance is evident. We should accept it, rather than prolonging discussions that on this basis cannot be concluded.
In my opinion, the talks with the United States have de facto failed, even though nobody really admits that. That is because they held 14 negotiation rounds based on 27 chapters. Not one agreement was made on any chapter.
If the French and Germans don't want it, it isn't going to happen. And their reluctance is down to that sense. It's a corporate lobbyist's dream. Now, back in the 1980s, there was a widespread perception in Britain that the trade unions were too powerful and too selfish.
The unions want a guaranteed weekly wage. Ford say it would bankrupt them.
Over the course of a decade, that power was cut back. So are we on the cusp of a long era in which corporate power is in decline? A quick note on the weirdness of what looks like an anti-global, anti-multinational tilt in sentiment. It is itself a global multinational phenomenon, one that covers the United States and most of Europe. And there's another thing. The Apple decision by the EU kind of demonstrates that if you want to take on a multinational, the typical nation state is too small to lead the fight. It was by taking control away from Ireland that the EU could take Apple on. So we're in a kind of muddle over who's fighting what battle right now. One other issue, consumers are not going to want to give up the benefits of the multinational era. Smart products at affordable prices. We may push back, but we're not about to let go of the whole thing. Well, joining me now is the Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, who you might say foresaw the backlash against globalisation way back, in fact, before the financial crisis, when his book, Globalisation and Its Discontents, was published back in 2002. He's got another one now on the euro called The Euro and Its Threat to the Future of Europe. Professor Stiglitz, thanks for coming in.
Nice to be here.
Do you think we are on a kind of, if you like, a long cycle, if you like, against the multinationals? They've had a good couple of decades, maybe it's turned?
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word against them. It's trying to rebalance. The fact is that they've been bad actors. They talk about social responsibility. The first social responsibility is paying the taxes that you make on the profits that are garnered from the activities you carry on a country. And what Apple has done, and it's only one of many examples, has avoided the taxes. They might say, oh, we just obey the law, but they did sweetheart deals and they use their influence to shape the law so they don't have to pay taxes, while the rest of us have to pay taxes.
Right. Now, look, we know that when you have a backlash against the pendulum swings one way, it then tends to swing too far the other. Do you see any danger that we'll throw babies out with bathwater here?
Not in this particular case, because Apple does have some lobbyists, and Google and all the rest. It's just like, did we swing too far in banking regulation? I don't think so. The general sense in the United States, at least, is that we had a compromise after the crisis of 2008. It was 350 million Americans wanted more regulation. 10 banks said no. And we got a compromise halfway between the power of 10 versus 350 was roughly balanced. So that's the kind of thing that we're likely to get.
But I mean, it is very easy, isn't it, to look at the losers from globalization and then dismiss the whole thing, and to actually not talk about, and you're a progressive, liberal guy, not talk about the hundreds of millions of huge gainers, most of whom are not appearing on our news programs and our talk shows, who are sitting in China, in middle-income country now, probably have running water, which they didn't have 30 years ago, and DVD player, and have just basically seen their life transformed from this thing we called globalization, Apple putting money into places like that and building products and selling them to us from there. I mean, come on.
There were big benefits, but you noticed they said escaping taxes in one country of one company, $13 billion. Now, if you're taking some of that $13 billion and spent it on retraining workers in the north of England or in the mid-Rust Belt of the United States, you would have had less discontented people. And you would have had a more productive economy. Your clip talked about TTIP, and we're having a big debate about TPP.
TPP, the other one, the Pacific one, yeah.
They've done an analysis of what is the impact on economic growth. Okay, the most optimistic, this comes out of the government itself, is after about 15 or 20 years, 0.15% on GDP. Other more reliable estimates is negative. This is not about growth. This is about shaping the economy, and it's a power grab on the part of corporations to make sure that they're not regulated, that they're not taxed, that they can despoil the environment. And your clip put it very clearly. Excess power, there has to be a check at some point.
Right. And so you'd be against the Pacific Partnership, the TPP. You're against TTIP. You'd just stop all of these ones for now, at least.
The question, I'm not against trade, but it's trying to get the right balance. It's very interesting. The Democratic platform, all the presidential candidates in the United States have come out against TPP. Yeah. And what the Democratic platform has done is set a principles that are inconsistent with the administration's position on TTIP. So that's why these negotiations aren't going anywhere.
It's all in a complete mess. Look, we've got to talk about politics. You're American, you're visiting here. Obviously, this is a very interesting time. Is there a connection between Trump and what we're talking about today?
Oh, very much so. It's a more complicated issue, obviously, but it is a connection that you saw in the Brexit vote. Discontented people, people who were told there's a new world out there, globalization is going to bring you benefit, didn't do that. They are the people who've left behind. And the basic idea is if globalization had brought the benefits were promised, and if some of that extra growth had been shared, there wouldn't be this kind of discontent. And that was really one of the main points of my...
But you're not a Trump supporter, I'm guessing,
no.
Right? So what has gone wrong that we've had if you like, a problem in the world economy, a balance that's gone too far one way? The political reaction hasn't been support for your kind of candidates, it's been support for the candidates who are like completely the opposite of where you are.
Well, it's interesting. In the primaries in the United States, it was also enormous support for somebody like Bernie Sanders. Yeah. What it was is a statement that the traditional centrist parties, candidates, have not delivered on what they promised. And it's a message, and I think it's a message that Hillary Clinton has gotten, that you need a different agenda, and that means we have to do a better job of protecting the people who have not been the winners.
So when you look back at Gordon Brown and Tony Blair's name on the left here is mud. When you look back at him as a Prime Minister here, do you think it was a disaster in which globalisation was untrammeled and was uncontrolled, or do you think he was a Prime Minister who did his best to kind of tame this beast?
I think you have to look at it in historical context. I don't think he did what he should have done to tame it. Just like I think it was a mistake in the United States for repeal of Glass-Steagall, the deregulation of the financial sector. But you have to look at it in historical context. That was the spirit of the time. These are not economists. I was very strongly opposed to the financial deregulation, but I was coming at it from economics. These were people who were politicians that were listening to the voices in the air and the campaign contributors.
Does it bother you that the left, post-financial crash, the left story has been, if you like, or the centre left, not the further left, but the centre left has had trouble getting its ducks in a row, hasn't it? It hasn't had much of a story.
Well, I think in each country it's a different story. Yeah. In the United States, the problem was that Obama wasn't brave enough, if you want to think of it that he was afraid, I think, to take on the financial markets. We'd just been through trauma, and he said, let's try to walk on carefully. And I think it was a very big mistake. He brought on as his economic advisors the same people who had brought on the deregulation that caused the problem, and it was not a surprise that it didn't work, and it's not a surprise that there's such anger now. I mean, I think those mistakes in not dealing adequately with the global financial crisis are part of the anger that we're seeing today.
Should just talk a little about Europe. You're a big skeptic on the euro. You think obviously it's been quite a disaster. That's one of the messages of your new book. I mean, but you do say you think Britain might get on better outside the European Union. You're in a big minority in the economics profession in that. I mean, give us the scenario.
Well, the basic idea here is that you're still part of the global community. There's the WTO. It goes back to what I just said about TPP and TTIP. You're already lots of trade going on. The last bit doesn't get you what you thought, and you're paying a price for that. And so it's sort of what the issue here is, what are going to be the terms of the negotiated, you might call it settlement, divorce settlement, and if you get a reasonable deal consistent with what is in Europe's interest. Remember, Europe also says that global integration is a good thing. If you get one that's consistent with their interest, I think that there is no reason why this should be traumatic. And interestingly, markets view right now is that there isn't that trauma. The markets have not collapsed as if it was doomsday.
Listen on, because we're going to have more on the Brexit deal later in the programme. Professor Stiglitz, thank you very much.
Nice to be here.
Before we move on, let's just get a little more on Apple, the Irish, and that €13 billion late tax bill. Our business editor, Helen Thomas, is with me. Helen, where next for Apple? I mean, obviously, they're not just going to... The Apple and the Irish, what are they?
No, I mean, the first thing that happens is the lawyers swing into action. So both Apple and Ireland have said that they plan to challenge this decision in the European courts. So realistically, we could be 3 to 5 years away from getting an eventual sort of settled outcome.
The cash coming through the
Exactly.
door.
They do have to put the cash aside in the meantime, but the broader fallout could be quite interesting because I've been speaking to lots of tax advisors today and they expect to be quite busy with questions from multinationals wanting to review their tax arrangements and the government assurances they're based on, because of course this wasn't necessarily a question of Irish tax law, it was these tax rulings they'd given that enabled Apple to allocate profit in a certain way. Now, The Commission has already said they're looking at Amazon and McDonald's tax arrangements in Luxembourg. And it's a very similar issue to do with these tax rulings, but those actually date back to an original investigation started in 2013. Since then, the Commission has expanded its work. It's reviewed over 1,000 tax rulings. So the expectation is that we could see some more cases along these lines.
Of course, Ireland, I mean, actually, the United States professes to not be very happy with this particular decision today.
No, well, no one seems terribly happy. The US, the Treasury there has raised various concerns related to the EU sort of trampling over national sovereignty, related to it potentially undermining sort of efforts to harmonise tax rules globally. But even in the US, there are people that concede that the EU is acting where governments either can't or won't because they're either worried about jobs and investment, or in the US, there has been total gridlock on efforts to reform its tax system for years. And the US tax system creates some of these incentives for its companies to organise themselves in these weird and wonderful ways.
Helen, thank you.
Let's dive straight on in. Page 8 of the Mail, and a story which I think some people did see coming. But perhaps not to the extent, well, that the EC has decided. £11 billion they're going to have to pay to the Irish government.
Absolutely, and the Mail points out that they could pay up to £5 billion in interest in all of this, because it's £11 billion, 13 billion euros plus interest. It's the numbers in this that are so totally eye-watering, and the Mail breaks it down quite nicely here. Apple makes £1,220 profit per second. It is the most profitable company in the world. Its stock value is $600 billion. It's a giant, a behemoth of a company. And because of this, it has incredible power on the global stage. And that is ultimately what all of this is about. It's about who wields power in the world. Is it states? Is it big corporations, or is it political entities like the EU? And this is this pendulum swing, the EU saying, no, we are not going to allow special arrangements for mega-rich corporations. This may be well, it is the beginning, because the EU has Google in its sights. Last year it looked at Starbucks, but what Starbucks was ordered to pay back in the Netherlands was kind of chicken feed. The figures are amazing, though. This has been bandied about a lot, but it is amazing that for every £1 million that Apple made in 2014
in profit.
They paid £50 in tax, which is, you know, I mean, you can't even buy a pair of headphones.
So I just had a little voice in my ear from one of our staff in the gallery who just went, what, at that particular figure there. And I think that's the reaction of pretty much everyone, really.
I think it's the sheer scale of the way Apple do their business, though, which is what has generated such a massively huge fine, possibly the biggest fine in sort of, tax corporate history. I once had occasion to be in Apple's flagship store on Fifth Avenue in New York City when the iPads were just being invented, just coming out, and I was in this enormous store. It's sort of underground, but it's half a sort of entire pavement block basically, and they were breaking open these crates of iPads, huge giant crates on pallets. They didn't have time to get them on the shelves, and they could not give them to customers fast enough before they had to break in another crate. And the sheer volume, and this was devices were going for, what, $500 a pop? So if you have that much turnover, you become suddenly extremely attractive to a country like Ireland to give you such a tiny tax rate as 0.005%.
But you can also afford to pay tax. That's the other thing. If you've got that much turnover, it's so greedy. The greed at the heart of this is incredible.
It is, but the problem comes back to the scale, because Apple have such a massive turnover, they create such massive profits. Even taking a tiny fraction of those profits is a huge earner for a country the size of Ireland, which is why the likes of Apple have effectively been able to dictate their own tax rates wherever they've gone in the world. And this is an absolute landmark moment where someone somewhere, and it just has to be the European Union, and there is a small irony, some may say, in Alex Brummer, the Daily Mail's city editor, commenting on what a wonderful job the EU has done here, as the Daily Mail, of course, is an excellent cheerleader for Brexit, praising the EU for this, that it is the EU who have finally said the buck is now going to stop, and you are going to be held accountable.
Yeah, but if, as you say, that we can distinguish this perhaps from ordinary tax avoidance, where people have identified ways in which they can game the system, this was a situation in which a sovereign nation decided, right, we are going to make a deal with Apple. Shouldn't the EC have targeted at least some of its ire against the Irish government or whoever was in charge at that point, whoever has signed off it every year since then?
I think they should have done it, but the really perverse situation is, A, they haven't done, and B, the Irish government has been told that it's owed at least £11 billion plus interest, and it's saying, no, we don't want this money, no, it shouldn't be ours. I mean, if I was Irish, I would feel very uncomfortable that my government was doing this. This is a vast sum of money to a country that needs this kind of money.
But, of course, the Irish government, which protested bitterly against the EU ruling today, said we stand basically to gain far more if we continue this sort of sweetheart deals than if we just trouser the 11 billion in fines. So actually the EU have done what the Irish government says is something quite unpleasant to them.
The point of the Financial Times lead article appears to be, right, who next? Where does this go? I mean, now that the EC, now that the EU have bloodied themselves in the battle with Apple, do we think that it's likely they're going to go after some of the other big global multinationals?
I think it's highly likely, and it would be no bad thing either. In a way, it's almost like calling out the Emperor's New Clothes list, because the likes of Apple, Starbucks, Amazon, Google, huge tech companies have really been seen so far as too big to mess with. If you mess with them, they withdraw their business and you are left without massive amounts of either tax takings or revenues that they bring to your country company. So really, the ball is now back in Apple's court. Tim Cook, the CEO, has been making all sorts of highly provocative and, quite frankly, ridiculous, hysterical comments today, such as, this is a terrible invasion on Ireland, sovereignty is a sovereign nation, they should be allowed to set their own tax rates. That hasn't existed since the EU's basically been existing. They've been harmonising tax rates, and VAT in Brussels have quite a big say in that sort of stuff, so that's bunkum. But what are Apple going to now do about this? Are they really wanting to stop selling iPhones and iPads to the EU's 500 million citizens? I don't think so.
The other thing is that these big American corporations, these big American tech corporations largely, although it is Starbucks as well, they have the US government behind them. The US government who has, expressed its displeasure that the EU is going after big American corporations. So it's not just that they are very rich, very powerful companies. They also have the might of the most powerful government in the world behind them. This is going to run on and on. There are going to be appeals. It's going to go on for a very long time. There was this other question today. There was a Downing Street spokesperson who said, Britain is open for business. We would welcome, in effect saying that we would welcome Apple on our shores, which would be, a highly embarrassing, awful move if we were prepared to offer sweetheart deals like this. The fact is, people should pay their taxes, and corporations in particular that have such eye-watering profits really should pay their taxes. It is despicable greed, and we can't collude in tax. It's not tax avoidance; it's the construction of tax laws in your favour.
And I actually just on that story, the Downing Street spokesman was a little illiberal in his phraseology there. I don't think he really meant to say what he said. And he certainly didn't expect slightly cheeky journalists in recess to write the story up in the way that a lot have had this morning. We are simply not going to be offering sweetheart deals to Apple to come here. It is politically totally unacceptable. I don't think Theresa May would even want to at the best of times. So that's a story that can probably be discounted.
Yeah, true. And worth pointing out as well, I mean, despite the bleating by, amongst others, the US Treasury, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, as the FT's Lex column actually itself points out, yep, Apple's punishment is unprecedented in its harshness and at the same time a much better deal than it could have expected to get in the United States.
Because the US charges very high levels of corporation tax on its companies, ironically, and a lot of them go away and pay it.
I've been again.